No turning back. There's no turning back. 'Cause where I'm going, there's no turning back. No turning back. There's no turning back. 'Cause where I'm going, there's no turning back.
Good morning. We are beginning a new series today called No Turning Back. This is part of our continued study of the life of Jesus from one of the biographies in the Bible, from the Gospel of John. We started this several months ago, and we've been walking through his life, learning who he is, seeing how he interacts with people, appreciating his miracles, and even hearing his teaching as words spoken to us to help us learn to follow him. And so if you are brand new with Bridgepoint, or maybe this is your first time and a long time back with us, then you are jumping in at the perfect time, because in this series, No Turning Back, we are looking at the events that surround the two events that hold our faith together, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so you're jumping in to hear what is most important, what's most central to our faith. If you've been around for a while, maybe you've been following Jesus for a while, you've been a part of the church, then these are events that we talk about often, but sometimes from a distance. You know, we mention the death of Jesus, or we reference the resurrection of Jesus as something that is very important to our faith, to our identity, but we rarely dive deep into it to understand exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means for us. And so in this series, No Turning Back, we are looking at these final scenes in the life of Jesus, where he chooses this, where he walks into it, where there is no turning back for him, not because he can't, but because he won't. He is committed to accomplishing the work he came to earth for. And when he does it, it demonstrates his devotion to us and to his disciples, and it also calls us into a life of devotion to him. And so I'm really excited about this. I'm thankful that you are here. As part of this series, each week in the program, you will see a list of recommended readings. It's just daily Bible reading that accompanies the theme and the text for the week, and so you can follow along on your own. Also available online are reflection questions that may help you dive a little further into that study on your own, and so we encourage you to use that. If you don't have a Bible, you can grab one from here, take it with you. We'd love to make that our gift to you. And on that note, if you would choose to, you can go ahead and pull that out now. We're going to show you where we're going to be. So we're going to be in John chapter 18, verses 1 through 27 today. And this is really the scene that sets in motion Jesus' final movement to the cross. All right? This has been coming for a while, but it's in this scene that Jesus chooses to give himself to the events that will transpire, that will eventually culminate in his crucifixion. And so right before this, okay, so we're going to be in John 18. The series that we're just in, this farewell tour, was a look at some of the last words Jesus spoke to his disciples. So in the scene right before where we're going to be today, we read this. This is John chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. This sets the stage. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. So having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. And so this is the beginning of what is often known as the Last Supper, where Jesus takes his 12 closest friends, his disciples, and he shares a meal with them on the evening before he is crucified. And so around this table, this is when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. It's when he shares in what we now remember as the Lord's Supper. You know, the breaking of bread, the drinking of wine to remember his body and blood that were broken and spilled for us. It's also the scene where he teaches them, spends an extended time, as recorded in John, teaching them about the Holy Spirit, how they're going to have trouble, maybe even be hated by the world, but they can overcome it. And then the end of this time around the table is spent praying. John 17 is a prayer Jesus offers for his disciples then and now. And as that prayer concludes, he stands up and his disciples with him, and they leave the place they've been dining. And that's where our story begins. in John chapter 18, verse 1. We read, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. And so up to this point, the meal has been shared in what was known as an upper room. It was kind of like a secret place, probably rented or loaned from a close friend of Jesus, someone who knew him. And so they were given this place in Jerusalem where they could share a meal together in privacy, without being interrupted, without the religious leaders coming to criticize Jesus. And so they leave that room, and this is the middle of the night by now, and they start to make their way out of the city of Jerusalem. So you've got this silent and small parade, Jesus and his disciples leaving the city. And Jerusalem was a city on a large mount, a large hill. And so as they left, they would descend into the Kidron Valley, and on the other side of the valley was a small hill called the Mount of Olives. Now you might guess from there that the Mount of Olives was covered with olive trees. It was a grove, and at the center of it was a garden, probably a privately owned plot of land that had a perimeter of a stone fence, and then within it was an olive press. It was very private, secluded. And so Jesus led his disciples down into the valley, up the Mount of Olives, and into what was known as the Garden of Gethsamane. And this was his private place to spend his last few moments with his disciples. Another account in the Gospel of Luke tells us that it was here that he called a few of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, to come over with him and to pray. And it was in that prayer that he begged God to take the cup from him, but he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And then John picks up the story in verse 2 of chapter 18. It says, while Jesus and his disciples are in Gethsemane, they're praying, they're retreating. Verse 2 says, now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So there was this group of people who hated Jesus. They hated him because he didn't play by their rules. They hated him because he loved people who were far from God and had messy lives. And I think ultimately they hated him because they were threatened by him. And this group of people was the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. And so for much of Jesus' public life, the last few years, they wanted to kill him. They wanted to arrest him, capture him, and kill him, to be done with him. And they had even attempted to take his life a couple different times, but Jesus slipped away quietly and slipped out of their grasp. And so they had been plotting, we've got to get rid of him. He's going to cause trouble for us. Let's plot a scheme that will end in his demise. The problem was that Jesus was so wildly popular that they feared trying to arrest him in public. They feared that if they tried to capture him in a public place with a lot of people around, many would come to his defense and maybe a riot would break out or even a small insurrection. And so they needed a private place to arrest Jesus. The other problem was that they didn't know where Jesus kept slipping off to. They knew where he was in public, but Jesus would disappear for time, and they didn't know where to find him. And so that's why they came to Judas, to contract him, to bribe him, to out Jesus. They needed someone on the inside that had the information that would tell them a private place they could go and capture Jesus. And so I don't know exactly how they knew that Judas would be the weak link in the chain. Sometimes you can just tell, but they go to him, they offer him a sum of money, and he says, that sounds good. And so he was bribed to turn Jesus over to them. So that evening, while Jesus ate with his disciples, Judas slipped out while they continued to talk and pray, and he went to the religious leaders. He said, I'll bring him to you tonight. Now, likely, Judas led this entourage, this band of soldiers and temple guards. He led them first to the upper room, because that's where they were when he left. But when that room was empty, he thought, I know where they are. There's only one other place. And so he now leads this band, this detachment, out of Jerusalem and down through the valley and up the Mount of Olives. And this is clearly a group of people who are ready for a fight. They're carrying lanterns and torches because it's dark, but they're also bringing with them weapons just in case things get violent. And at this we read, back to the story in verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, If you have a pen and a Bible in front of you, if you're looking at a screen and you can highlight, I want you to highlight those words, knowing all that was going to happen to him. That's a key part of this passage. Knowing all that was going to happen to him, he went out and asked them, "Who are you looking for, or who is it that you want?" They replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Now, it may seem strange that they're telling Jesus that they're looking for Jesus, but remember that it's dark, very dark. It's in a rural hillside, middle of the night, and so even with torchlight, it may be hard for them to recognize Jesus. Maybe he shaved, I don't know. But for some reason, they can't recognize him. So they say, "We're looking for Jesus." And in the original language, Jesus responds with two words. He says, "I am." Now to us, that doesn't sound like that much, but to anyone familiar with Jewish history, they would recognize that as the personal name God attributed to himself way back when he appeared to Moses in the burning bush. He said, "I am." That's my name. And it was such a name that Jews would not speak it. They would barely even write it. They revered it. They feared it. But Jesus used it to identify himself. And so when they say, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth," Jesus says, "I am he," or "I am." Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them, and when Jesus said, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, we don't know exactly what happens here. There are a couple of possibilities. Either they are so surprised that the one they have come to capture has come out to them to surrender, that they're startled when Jesus identifies himself, and in their surprise, that they shrink back a little bit and stumble over each other and hit the ground like a bunch of dominoes. That's certainly possible. The other possibility is that when Jesus says the words, "I am," when he calls upon the name of the Almighty God, that there is some divine power that comes with it that sends them to the ground. I don't know which it is. But either way, they have tumbled to the ground in the presence of Jesus when they're supposed to be the aggressors. And now, Jesus brings them back to the same question in verse 7. He asks them again, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said again. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am." There's that name again. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." So his disciples are standing behind him. And he goes, "I don't want you to harm them. I don't want you to arrest them. I'm standing between you and them. Take me and let them go free." This was his way of saying, "I'm not putting up a fight." This was a volatile scene because this mob has clearly come for a fight, right? And you know, like in a dark setting, when the stakes are high, like it wouldn't take much, if anything, to send them into a battle, right? Like one swing, one punch, one glimmer of a blade, that could be enough to cause someone to react or overreact. But Simon Peter, we read this in verse 10, it says, "Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus commanded Peter, 'Put away your sword. Shall I not drink from the cup the Father has given me?'" So Peter is always at the center of the action. He's the disciple that's always quick to speak, even if it's the wrong thing. He's the one who is quick to assert himself, even if it's doing the wrong thing. He's one of those ready, fire, aim kind of guys, right? Or he's just like, he's in the action. And so Peter draws whatever kind of sword he has, and it's not a sword because they're not soldiers. It's likely some primitive version of a pocket knife. Maybe you have a friend who's always quick to pull out a pocket knife for like anything, right? And that's what Peter does here. It's likely maybe the butcher's knife they used to carve up the Passover lamb. And so he draws it. And in this moment of panic, he just swings it. He's not aiming for the guy's ear. He's trying to kill him, right? But he's a fisherman, not a fighter. So even in this, he swings and misses and nicks off the guy's ear. And Luke's account of this scene tells that Jesus stooped down, he picked up the guy's ear, and immediately healed it and restored it. Now imagine being that guy, right? Where you've come to arrest Jesus. You're angry at him, you hate him, like we're going to drag him off. Your ear's cut off, and this guy just puts it back on. Like, do you turn to the soldiers and let's still get him? Or are you like, whoa, maybe we should reconsider? Whatever happens here, Jesus really rebukes Peter. He says, we're not here for a fight. Put away your sword. And he says, shall I not drink the cup the Father has for me. The cup refers to the punishment, the pain, the payment that he is about to suffer. He goes, shall I not take that? Shall I try to get out of that? The implication is obviously not. Verse 12 continues, and it completes the story. It says, then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. And Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. I'll explain that in a minute. So think about this scene. If you were reading this for the first time, this would blow your mind. If you were just reading through it, if you didn't know how the story ended, if you didn't know what was next, you would read John's account of Jesus, who performed miracles, who healed the sick, who gave sight to the blind, who raised a dead man back to life, who is now being dragged away, bound as a prisoner. And you go, what's going on here? Why doesn't he do something? See, this is a pivotal, maybe even the pivotal scene in the life of Jesus. This is the turning point where he gives himself to the cross, and there is no turning back. Again, not because he can't, but because he won't. And so this scene has much to teach us about Jesus. It sets us up to understand everything else that's going to unfold in the coming weeks. And so I want to make a few observations about what this reveals to us about Jesus. The first is this: Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen. Jesus knew exactly what was about to take place. Nothing was catching him by surprise. Nothing was catching him off guard. He knew what was going to happen. So for much of Jesus' life, he refers to this moment out in the distance as the hour of his death. So even as early as John chapter 2, so very early in this biography we've been studying, Jesus performs a miracle because his mom asks him to turn water into wine. But his initial response is, "Woman, my hour has not yet come." He's gazing off into the future, looking at this appointed moment that will cost him his life. He knows what is coming. And if you read through the Gospel of John, you will see several times he refers to this hour that is coming. There are times where he pulls his disciples off to the side and he says, "I'm not going to be with you forever. I'm going to die." Jesus knew what was coming. More specifically, he knew exactly what people would do to him. Listen to his prediction of his own death in Matthew chapter 20. He tells his disciples, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man," that's how he refers to himself, "the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles," that's Romans, "to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day he will be raised to life." Doesn't it sound like he knows what's coming? Like with great precision, with great accuracy, he says, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be tried. They're going to make fun of me and mock me, and then they're going to beat me and kill me. Jesus knows exactly what is going to happen. He knows that when the mob comes, they're going to turn him over to a bogus trial that will convict him of a crime that is not true. He knows at that point Roman soldiers will take him off in chains. They will stretch out his arms, exposing his back, and they will take pieces of leather laced with bone and glass and stone and metal, and they will rake it across his back. They know that they will force a crown of thorns on his face while they pretend that he's some kind of fake king, and he knows they will force him to carry his own cross up a hill, buckling under its weight more than once, only to get to the top, to be stretched out and nailed as a public spectacle of shame, to breathe his last breath, and to die. Jesus knows exactly what they're going to do to him, but he also knows that that's not even the worst that's going to happen. He knows that there's a spiritual implication of his death that will far surpass the tragedy of his physical suffering. And it's what's mentioned, it's what's referenced in this cup that he is going to drink. See, to us, it doesn't sound familiar to us. but to a Jew who had studied their history and who knew their practices. Every first century Jew would understand that this cup that is mentioned by Jesus here referred to the cup of God's wrath. There was this idea that God could not look past sin. He couldn't excuse it. He couldn't pretend that it wasn't there. And because of that, every sin had to be punished. Now, at first, that may sound like an offensive idea to us. We may wish that God could overlook sin. We may wish that God could look past our own evil or the wrongs that we have done, but the reality is we do not want this universe governed by a sovereign being who cannot distinguish between good and evil, right? We don't want that. That thought is terrifying. I mean, imagine being in a family where there was no difference between right and wrong. Imagine working at a place where there was no distinction between good and evil. Imagine being a part of a friendship that had no standard for how to treat each other. We wouldn't want any of those. You wouldn't want to send your child, or you wouldn't want to be a student at a school where there was no distinction between right and wrong. When we see wrong, we need to name it as such, right? And it's the same for God. God distinguishes between good and evil, right and wrong. And because of that, he demands that all wrongs be made right. And that may terrify us, but it also enables us to trust him. And so, because of that, Israelite history used this metaphor of a cup of wrath that had been filling. The idea was that any time someone defied God or disobeyed him, that a drop of wrath would be put into that cup. And that cup was filling for all of human history. And at some point it would have to be poured out. At some point there would have to be punishment and payment for all sin and evil in this world. But God, in his kindness, in his patience, in his forbearance, had been holding on to the cup himself, not pouring it out on his people, not even pouring it out on the nations, but holding it and even withholding it. But people knew that someday, somehow, God's wrath would have to be executed. We're told in Psalm 75 of this idea, this cup of wrath. Psalm 75, verses 7 and 8. It says, "It is God who judges. He brings one down and exalts another. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out on, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs." It's saying that God is the one who judges, and at some point, these wrongs have to be made right. Jesus knew that he was going to be the one that would drink that cup of wrath. Every ounce of punishment that all of humanity deserved would be poured onto him. That he would become sin in the eyes of God his Father. And in that moment on the cross, God would have to abandon his own son. He'd have to turn away from him. Jesus knew what was coming. He knew exactly what would happen to him. And if you've ever had a day that you dreaded, maybe it was an appointment at work, a meeting that you just did not want to walk into. Maybe it was a test at school that you had not studied for. Maybe it was time with someone that just, you knew it wasn't going to go well. If you've ever had a day you've dreaded, you know what you want to do is escape it, right? You just want to avoid it. And if not that, you want to do everything in your power to change it. And so it's Jesus' awareness of what is coming that makes this next part so amazing. Jesus didn't only know exactly what was going to happen, but he could have stopped it at any moment. Jesus could have stopped it at any moment. Because understand this, John takes very careful steps as he's telling the story of Jesus' life to explain that Jesus is God. He begins his account of the life of Jesus by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That's his way of saying Jesus is God. Throughout his account, there are several times where he makes it very clear that Jesus is one with God. Even in this story, we see that when the mob approaches Jesus, he responds by saying, "I am God." That's what he was saying. Even as he's surrendering himself, he's making it clear that nothing has changed about who he is. And so because of that, Jesus could have stopped this at any moment. Because he was no less God in the garden than he was in heaven for eternity before he came to earth. He was no less God in the garden than he was in the moment of his miraculous conception when he was born to the Virgin Mary. He's no less God in the garden than when he raised the dead or gave sight to the blind. He's no less God in the garden than when he is resurrected a few days later. Understand that right there, as the mob is approaching him and they're going to tie him up, he is no less God than he's ever been, which means he still has access to divine, unlimited power, which means that he could have stopped it in a moment. A snap of his fingers could have sent the soldiers flying. A word uttered from his voice could have brought down angels from heaven to his rescue. Even as his hands are being tied and he's being led away, he is the sovereign God who is sustaining the breathing lungs and the beating heart of his captors. He could have stopped it at any moment. There had been previous attempts on his life. They tried to capture him, they tried to kill him, but it never worked. The only reason it's working now is because Jesus is letting it happen. He's the one with power. And so this scene shows us that he's the one that is letting this happen. He's the one who is choosing this. I have kids who are in elementary school, and so they're at this fun age where we get to play games together. Could be board games. A lot of times we like to go outside and play sports together. And so I'm at this sweet point where they're old enough to play, but they're still young enough that I can win when I want to, right? Like we were playing basketball the other day, and they're on a team against me. My daughter's 9 and my son is 6, and so they're playing against me. And don't tell them, but I could block their shots, right? I could keep them from passing to each other. I could probably even steal the ball when we play, right? But I don't. I withhold that ability, which lets them have fun. It's good for them, right? We had a moment like this earlier in the week, celebrating my daughter's birthday. We went to Sky Zone, and they have this area where there's a jousting competition. And so when we start, I let my kids get a leg up on me, right? I let them take it to me, all right? So they're beating me up. But the only reason that's happening, right, is because I'm letting it happen, and eventually I need them to know who's the boss, and so this happens, right? And it changes. It's funny to talk about with kids, but the reality is the same thing is true with Jesus. He's the one who has the upper hand. He's the one who is determining what happens. And so when he is captured, when he is led off, when he's beaten and crucified, it is only because he is letting it happen. No one is defeating him. He's giving himself to it. And it's essential for us to understand this because this leads to the third and most important understanding from this passage, and that is that Jesus decided to die for sin because of his devotion to us. Jesus decided to die for sin because of his devotion to us. It is not an accident. It is not a coincidence. He is not a victim here. Jesus chose this. And the entire story really focuses in on that. Everything from him going out to meet the mob, to calling off Peter and the violent opposition, to him saying, I've got to surrender myself to the Father. Everything reveals that Jesus is choosing this. He withholds his power as God so as not to oppose those who are coming to capture him. And the reason is because he knows that this has to happen in order for him to accomplish what he came to do. He could have found a way out of it. He could have forced a way out of it, but he chose not to. And you may wonder why it is so important for me to establish that this was a decision Jesus made. Why do we go through the trouble to say he knew what was coming? And he could have stopped it at any moment, but because he let it happen, that means he decided. Why is it so important for us to say that? It's because when we look at the scenes that are about to unfold, when we look at this fake trial, when we look at the Roman soldiers making fun of Jesus, when we look at them stripping him down, forcing him to carry a cross, stretching his arms out and killing him, we need to be sure that we understand that it was not because that's what the religious leaders wanted. It's not because it's what the the Roman soldiers wanted. It's not even because that's what the crowds wanted. When we see these stories unfold over the coming weeks, we need to understand that it's all happening because it's what Jesus wanted to happen. And he wanted it to happen because he knew what was at stake. He knew that it was the only way for you to be right with God. Because unless there is someone who is willing to take God's wrath that we deserve for us, we've got to drink it on our own. And he loves you too much to force that on you. He loves you too much to give you that as your only option. So he steps into your place and says, if only you will give yourself to me, if only you will hand over the cup you deserve to drink, I will take it for you. And so it was in this that Jesus surrendered himself to this fate, knowing that that's what it would take to win back his children, to give hope and forgiveness and life to those who would believe in him. His mission was always clear, and we've seen it at different times as we've been studying this biography. Way back in the beginning, in John chapter 1, Jesus is described as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Later, in chapter 10, Jesus uses this analogy of being a shepherd, and in verse 11 he says, I'm the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. All along, Jesus' intention was to give himself for us so that we could find a way to forgiveness, so that we could be made right in the sight of God, so that we didn't have to suffer under the punishment of the sins that we have chosen. And so when we read this, it begs the question, how do we respond to a devotion that great? When we know that Jesus has chosen this for us because he loves us and longs to spend eternity with us starting right now, then how in the world do we respond? What is the right response, or how does a disciple respond to devotion like that? As John is telling this story, he carefully weaves the story of a disciple into it to make sure that these two remain connected to each other. And the disciple he chooses to focus on is Peter, who was often at the center of the action. And so John tells the story of how Peter responded in this moment of devotion of Jesus. Verse 15 of chapter 18 says this, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Remember, the mob has just arrested Jesus, they're dragging him off, and now Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus down the valley and back into the city of Jerusalem. And because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to a servant girl on duty and brought Peter in. So Peter gets stopped at the door. Are you with me so far? But this other disciple has some connections, and so he comes back. He's like, okay, you're good. You're with me. And so now the other disciple, who is actually the author, John, and Peter go into the courtyard. When they're going in, verse 17, someone asks, aren't you one of the man's disciples too? They ask Peter. To which he replies, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So up to this point, he's denied Jesus once. If you skip down to verse 25, because again, John is weaving these stories together so that we see how closely they're connected. Verse 25 says, meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, aren't you one of his disciples too? Again, Peter denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Another account, the biography of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, says that at that moment, the third denial of Peter, Jesus shifted his gaze across the courtyard to lock eyes with Peter, and in that moment, Peter wept bitterly because he loved Jesus. Up to that point, he had been more dedicated than anyone to Jesus. He was the one just a few moments ago that was willing to die in a battle to free his master, and yet in this moment of weakness, of fear, of insecurity, whatever it was, he caved. And he denied his master, his friend, his Lord, his God. And it broke his heart. It devastated him. And it seems like this would have been a really helpful detail for John to edit out, right? I mean, if John is telling the story of one of his closest friends, you'd think that he'd cut Peter some slack, right? Or maybe tell the story of a different disciple, tell his own story. But for some reason, all 4 biographies of Jesus include this scene where Peter, the spokesperson for the disciples, denies Jesus 3 times and is devastated by it. The question is, why is that? Why is this story of denial so important to the story of Jesus' devotion? And the answer to that, I believe, is because it gives us a story we can relate to. It gives us a way for us to see ourselves in the story. If the disciples only had a perfect response to Jesus, we'd look at that and be like, man, good for them. But I don't see myself there. Because I know that I don't follow Jesus perfectly. But instead, he gives us a story of a disciple we can relate to. Because even though Jesus is so unwaveringly devoted to us, we still deny him at times. And just like Peter, it's not all the time. Like there are moments where our faith is steadfast and strong, right? Where it is unwavering. We would be willing to almost die for Jesus if that's what it took. We'll give him anything. There are moments where our faith is fierce. But then there are other times, moments of weakness where fear or insecurity or uncertainty or some other factor pushes us into this moment of denial that we never anticipated. Where when push comes to shove, in one way or another, whether it's with our thoughts, our words, our decisions, we either say to ourselves or others, I'm not with him anymore. He is not mine, and I am not his. We choose life apart from him, we deny him, we defy him, we disobey him. In one way or another, we are just like Peter, fickle at best in our faith. And I believe that's why this story is so closely woven in. It's because we need to understand that even though Jesus is perfectly devoted to us and we are so imperfectly devoted to him, there is still hope for us. That because of Jesus' devotion to us, our denials don't have to destroy us. It doesn't have to be the end. It doesn't have to be the defining moment in our life. Jesus did not die for you because he expected perfect obedience from you after that. He died for you because he knew you were incapable of perfect devotion to him. He knew that you would need grace and forgiveness and mercy, which is why he went to the cross. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says this: God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I want you to hear this, that even at your worst, Jesus went to the cross for you. That he didn't wait for you to clean yourself up or to prove that you would be faithful to him. He said, even if they stay in their weakest moment, even if they are at their worst, I will give my life for them. And so because of that, this story of Jesus' devotion and our denial results in hope, because that's not the end of the story. If you stick with us for the 5 weeks of no turning back, you will see by the end that Peter's story resolves beautifully. That there is a closing scene in this story of Jesus that is breathtakingly beautiful in how it brings the disciple back to Jesus. And I hope you are with us for that. But I know that also you don't want to wait 5 weeks to know how the story resolves, right? And so you just need to know that Jesus offers you a chance to return to him. No matter how far you run from him, no matter what you've done or what's been done to you, it doesn't matter how many times or in what ways you have denied him, there's a place with Jesus for you because he loves you and he died to make things right. And so you just need to believe in him and surrender your life to him. And there's something else that we can learn from this story. See, Peter was not the only disciple that denied Jesus. There were actually 2. The other was mentioned earlier, Judas. Sold Jesus out for a bribe. And so on one hand, you have Judas, who betrayed Jesus. On another hand, you have Peter, who denied him. In some ways, they are very similar. But the outcome of their lives could not be more different. See, when Judas turned against Jesus, he experienced a great amount of grief, probably even remorse and sorrow, but he separated himself from the others. He ran into isolation to deal with it himself. which led to a cycle of despair and eventually suicide. His life was devastated and destroyed by his denial. But Peter, on the other hand, experienced something very different. He was devastated. He was grieved. He had great sorrow over his sin. And yet, instead of running into isolation, he ran back to the disciples. Every scene we find Peter in from here on out, he is with the other disciples. He did not let his sin separate himself from his God or his people. And I think for us, we need to hear this. That when you deny Jesus, your inclination is to run from community, right? To isolate yourself, to not let people in, to try and deal with it on your own, and I'm telling you that it will destroy you. But your denial doesn't have to be the end of the story. You've got a God who's already giving you grace. You just need people around you to make sure you get back to that grace. And that is the nature and purpose of the church. We all will turn from Jesus at some point, but because of that, we all need Jesus to turn us back to him. We all need each other to help us on our way. And so we are in this together. And so to whatever degree you feel like you need to turn back to Jesus, we invite you to do that in this moment. And you know that you've got a God who is devoted to you. Let me pray. Father God, I pray that you would please help us to love you well. Your devotion is unending, it's unconditional, it is extravagant. You love us so well, and I pray that our response might in some way return that devotion to you. That you would help us to be steadfast and strong, and even in those moments of weakness, that we would be quick to run back to you, and we would be quick to let others into our lives to turn us toward you. Jesus, thank you for your grace. Thank you for the sacrifice that you chose for us. In your name we pray. Amen. In just a moment, the ushers will come down, and they will pass trays that will have stacks of cups, bread